Jay Weidner, Reality Check. Thanks for watching. Hit like, subscribe, and tell your friends, and help me grow the station, my station here. I can't get over 20,000. I don't know why. We're trying our ass off, but we're just not making it. I don't know why. Maybe there's something about the algorithm. We don't know. Anyway, I got a good show today. About 6 months ago, I gave a virtual lecture at MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. I believe the branch in California. They were very nice to me, and they, listened patiently as I gave this talk that I'm about to give to you today. And it's called Kennedy, Kubrick, and the Secret Space Program. A lot of you guys ask me why I'm so interested in the, in the idea of the secret space program, why I care about it. And, I used to hang out in the early 90s with Richard Hoagland, the guy that wrote the book about the face on Mars. And we would go from NASA facility to NASA facility and look at photographs and all sorts of different evidence about the Apollo missions. And so I did a deep dive into the Apollo missions. And I met a lot of really cool people in NASA at that time. And they didn't like Richard so much, but they liked me. And I guess maybe because he was always getting on Art Bell and blabbing, they didn't want to tell him anything, but they told me that there was a secret space program. This is in the maybe 93. And they told me that there was a base on the moon. So I was like, okay, well, that's wild and weird. Wasn't until later that I would discover, of course, the front screen projection used in the Apollo imagery and the front screen projection used in the movie 2001, and connecting Stanley to the creation of the Apollo imagery, Stanley Kubrick, that is. So just after World War II, the Secretary of the Navy, who's named James Forrestal, went to visit the ruins of Germany after the bombings and the victory. He took with him his protege, who was a young, handsome guy named John F. Kennedy. They were both Irish Catholics, and they had a lot in common, and both from New England. And he took Kennedy under his wing. He was in his 40s, and Kennedy was in his early mid-20s, I would think. Yeah, mid-20s. So the two explored Germany, and they definitely visited the secret factories where the mysterious Bell technology was being developed. Now, we know from Joseph Farrell's great work on the Brotherhood of the Bell that the Bell was a bell-shaped device that used mercury, just like the Vedic text talked about how the flying devices that they created back thousands of years ago were powered by mercury. These German scientists also powered this Bell craft with red mercury, it was called. And it was an anti-gravity craft, and it could people saw it over by one of the factories in Poland where they were working. The peasants would come out at night and see this blue bell-shaped object floating around in the sky. So by 45, by the time that the Allies had the victory over the Germans, they had developed the Hanabu flying saucer with the Bell technology. Now, the reason that the Germans couldn't use their flying saucer technologies to win the war is because they hadn't figured out at that time what would happen is that the flying saucer they would put a gun on the flying saucer, and when the gun went off, the flying saucer would go flying that way. It was very dangerous to fire any projectiles off of the surface of one of these flying saucers, so they couldn't do it. It wasn't later when they developed plasma weapons that they could finally use flying saucers as weapons, which is how they defeated Byrd in Antarctica in 1947. So, and that they moved all of their stuff to Antarctica during the end of World War II and created a base there, the Germans did, where they polished up this flying saucer technology and learned how to use it better. Admiral Byrd, he went to Antarctica with a whole bunch of ships and got his butt kicked in, had to come back early. And And then we had the flying saucer scare in 1952 over Washington, D.C., in which flying saucers were flying right over the Capitol, freaking out the Pentagon, which then they realized how advanced the German technology was, and they brought a lot of them into our country via Operation Paperclip, including a great uncle of mine, by the way, Herman Weidner, came in on that operation. He was a physicist. So soon after Kennedy and Forrestal visited Germany, Kennedy came back home. He ran for Congress, became a congressman from Massachusetts. And James Forrestal would go on to become the very first Secretary of Defense. The department was called the War Department, and then they changed it after World War II to the Defense Department. And Forrestal was chosen to be the first leader of the Defense Department. Now, you have to understand that both Kennedy and Forrestal were Navy guys, and the Navy is the premier military force in the United States. And later, when NASA was created in the late 50s, the Navy was the overseer of NASA. So NASA is a Navy department, probably under the Space Force now, but it was a Navy department. So Forrestal becomes the Secretary of the Defense, and he also joins the group called MJ-12, which is a group of 12 guys, Vannevar Bush, a lot of big guys, the physicists, senators, military people were in MJ-12, otherwise known as Majestic 12. And MJ-12 was overseeing the flying saucer phenomenon. First asking what it was, and then bringing in the German scientists in Operation Paperclip, and then developing the flying saucers here in the United States. And we did that through the work of T. Townsend Brown, the great scientist. You can see his videos on YouTube of him in the 1950s working with flying saucer-shaped models that are flying around in his warehouse all on their own. And it was called gravitics. And gravitics was anti-gravity technology. If you really want to understand gravitics, I suggest you read Dr. Paul Laviolette's book on anti-gravity technology. Great book. He's an astrophysicist, a good friend of mine. So anyway, around 1950 became the marriage of American military and wealth combined with the German technology. And it was going really good. If you were around at the time, Popular Mechanics and all the magazines were putting out articles about how anti-gravity craft was just right around the corner, and everybody would be like the Jetsons and flying around in their cars, and we wouldn't have cars anymore. And all this went all the way up until the end of 1955, when suddenly the wall came down and no more talk about anti-gravity was anymore being said anywhere. Out of the popular literature, gone completely. Just about this time, Forrestal is lobbying to MJ-12 and to the people in the Pentagon to release this technology. Because not only was this technology, anti-gravity technology, you could be used to get off the planet and fly around effortlessly, but it was also free energy. You could create energy, zero-point energy, just draw energy right out of the atmosphere. And basically everyone would have free energy. And Forrestal rightly argued that this would save the planet. We could get rid of nuclear power. We could get rid of the hydroelectric dams and save everything by releasing this technology. But the military, they kind of believe in Sun Tzu's laws, the art of war, that the two things that you want in order to win a war, you want the high ground and you want secrecy. You don't want the enemy to know what you have. So they could not break free of this kind of mentality. So they said, no, we're going to keep it secret. And Forrestal, he argued pretty vociferously for this point of view, but at a certain point, he realized it was, he couldn't win. Unfortunately for him, at that point, he was thrown into Bethesda Medical Hospital for mental reasons. He was stuck in that hospital. His family couldn't come visit him. He was all alone in there, and and people from MJ12 would come visit him. The last person to see James Forrestal alive, I believe, was Senator Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who was also NASA's #1 senator. And then James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, decided to, they say, throw himself out the window and committed suicide, they say, and he died. Well, his death really hit Kennedy hard. Kennedy was his protege, and Kennedy really liked him. And Kennedy was being informed by Forrestal about all this stuff I just talked to you about. So he knew. So Kennedy tried to contemplate the situation, knowing that they weren't going to release any of these technologies, and they still haven't to this day. So he decided to run for president. So in 1960, he was elected president, and by a very slim margin. In fact, it was probably a thrown election. It looks like the mob in Chicago threw the election for Kennedy and got him Illinois, or he wouldn't have won that election. So he won by a very thin margin. He beat Nixon. And so Kennedy becomes president. Then he does something that just surprises the entire world. He hadn't been president very long when he made a speech in which he said that NASA, the newly created NASA, would, he said that our goal is to go to the moon by the end of the 1960s. This really took everybody by surprise. Nobody more than Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist, came in during Operation Paperclip, who had just said, like 6 months before Kennedy made his announcement, that rockets couldn't get us to the moon, that we would need a rocket the size of the Empire State Building, which is actually true. So Werner von Braun was like, what's he doing? We can't get to the moon with standard rocketry. And then as they began to slowly realize what Kennedy was really doing, they began realizing that what Kennedy was doing was he was forcing their hand. He knew that they couldn't get there to the moon with standard rocketry. He knew that they could get there with their gravitics, their zero-G craft. And so he pulled this trick on him, thinking that they would have to eventually show the craft that they had in secret, and then the secret would be revealed, and it would be revealed by the end of the 1960s. Well, of course, we know that didn't happen, and Kennedy stopped being president on November 22nd, 1963. And I'm lately causing a lot of controversy on my Facebook page by posting images from the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination, which goes up against the standard line, whether it be by the government or by conspiracy theorists, of what happened that day on November 22nd, 1963. I personally believe now, I know that Kennedy faked his death. For what reason, I have no idea. Maybe he was just tired of being president, who knows? Either way, Kennedy leaves the scene. Now, something else happened in 1963 that's a really important. And that was the year that Stanley Kubrick finished his film, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying About the Bomb. This was his satire on the military-industrial complex, Stanley Kubrick's satire. Hilarious, probably the funniest film ever made. Hilarious satire of our presidents and our generals and our Pentagon, and how crazy they are with their nuclear policies, and how they're going to destroy the world because they're just a bunch of insane nuts and idiots. And it was a hilarious movie. But when Kubrick went to the Pentagon, I believe it was in 1962, and asked them if he could have access to the B-52s so he could use them in the movie, they asked to read the script. He gave them the script, and they said, no way, we're going to help you. You're making fun of us. And he said, well, yeah, I guess I am. And so he didn't get to have any access to the B-52 bombers that they used to drop the atomic bombs. So he and his production designer, what they did is they went to, I believe it was Aviation Weekly magazine. They got a whole bunch of back issues of them, and they cut every picture out of a B-52, the interior, and they put them up on a wall. So they had like 150 pictures, different aspects of the inside of a B-52, and they rebuilt the inside according to these pictures. And word got back to the Air Force that Kubrick, had somehow got inside a B-52, figured out how it looked, which was a big secret, right? And so they flew 2 Air Force officers to England, where he was filming Dr. Strangelove, and demanded to see the B-52 set. So Kubrick, was kind of scared and was telling people how nervous he was about the Pentagon coming over here and looking at his set. He let them go in the set, and they were blown away. And they said, how did you do this? And he took them over to the big wall with all the pictures. And he said, this is how we did it. We figured it out through these photographs. And they went, wow, that's ingenious. And so they flew back to Washington, D.C., and told everybody in the Pentagon that whatever this movie, Dr. Strangelove, is, the detail, the attention to detail by Stanley Kubrick was jaw-dropping. So all of a sudden, Kubrick had this reputation all through the Pentagon, and no doubt through NASA, of being like this crazy nerd genius with attention to detail. But it wasn't until Dr. Strangelove came out that they were truly blown away, and not by the interior of the B-52, but by the shots of the B-52 flying over Siberia. Now, these were made with front screen projection, which is a process for how the Apollo images were made, and also all of the ape scenes in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey and the scenes on the moon in 2001: A Space Odyssey. These are all done using a process called front screen projection. The front screen projection is a little known process that they don't really use much anymore because of digital technology. But in those days, if there's no digital, so you either had to, you really only had 2 choices: rear screen projection or front screen projection. The problem with rear screen projection is that you're throwing a light on a screen behind your actors. So you have your actors are here, you have a screen here, then you have a projector here, back, rear. And it shines the images here, and then the actors act like they're inside this image that's being projected. The problem with rear screen projection is that it comes out to be about a half a stop less in exposure than what's on your actors. And there's really no way to solve it. The only way to solve it is with front screen projection. And what front screen projection is you have a screen of millions of little tiny glass beads. And these glass beads are 3M company made them. And these glass beads, they project 98% of the light that's being hit, is being hit on them. So 98% of the light that hits these glass beads is reflected back. And that's why front screen projection is so good. So your actors are standing in front of this very highly reflective screen, and there's no f-stop problems. Everything looks blended together and like it's really happening. And so what Kubrick did was he put the model of a B-52 in front of a front screen projection of a film going over Siberia, not Siberia, I think it was Alaska, but because he couldn't fly over Siberia because it was Russia. So then he stuck the thing in front of the front screen projection, and he moved, had a rotated thing, so it looked like it was moving around in the sky, and it looked like, today technology, it doesn't look that great, but in 1963, it was a mind blower. And they thought that Kubrick had literally taken some kind of B-52 and flown it over Siberia. And again, they demanded, he tell them what he did. And he said, I used front screen projection. I had a model made of a B-52, again, from photographs that I found in aviation magazines. And they said, okay. But now his reputation was like all the way up. Okay. So then, so now that, so the only other thing I want to bring up is that, as many of you know, I believe that the movie The Shining by Stanley Kubrick with Jack Nicholson is Stanley Kubrick's secret confession to working on the Apollo program. Every time that the movie deviates from the Stephen King novel, he's telling you about things that he went through while he was making the Apollo program. So when Wendy finds the book with the words "all work and no play make Jack a dull boy" written over and over and over and over, well, that's, you know, his secret work, you know, that he's doing. And she finds that out, and he doesn't want his wife to find it out, but she does find out that he's working on this secret program, and he's worried that she's going to get killed. And that's what's really going on in The Shining. So anyway, the 1964, NASA ramps up the Apollo program, the program that's going to get us to the moon before the end of the decade. 1964 is also the year that Stanley Kubrick decides to make the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, then called Voyage to the Stars. And he gets Arthur C. Clarke, probably the greatest known science fiction writer at the time, to help him write the screenplay. Arthur C. Clarke has many, many connections to NASA, to the German scientists that NASA brought over. He helped bring over Hermann Oberth, one of the German scientists. Arthur C. Clarke was the guy who said, he's okay, you can take him. And he was like the father of the German space program. So Arthur C. Clarke has all these connections. And Kubrick is like, I don't know, 33 maybe at this time, and Arthur's in his late 40s, and I believe that once they had gotten Kennedy out of the way, they now were going to not reveal their secret technology in any way, shape, or form. They were going to make it look like they got to the moon using standard rocketry, but they needed someone to help them make this look realistic. And the only person in Hollywood that you would hire at that time would have to be Stanley Kubrick, for two reasons. One, what he did in Dr. Strangelove, and two, at the time, Hollywood directors were not techno geeks. In other words, they come from theater. They were Broadway or theater directors who were brought into Hollywood to basically, you know, direct actors, and they really didn't understand cameras or editing or lighting or anything. But because Kubrick was a low budget filmmaker for his first 4 films, he had to learn everything himself. So he would light his own movies. He would do his own sound. He would do his own camera work. He had to do everything. So he knew everything from the ground up. And he was the only filmmaker at the time that really had this kind of intricate knowledge about filmmaking. So I believe in 1964, they offered Stanley Kubrick a gig to do this, to fake the Apollo footage. And Kubrick was then set with the problem, okay, this is going to be a huge, expensive project. I can't let anybody know I'm doing it. And I got to do a lot of research and development in order for me to be able to do this in the right way. So Kubrick came up with the idea of making a really big budget science fiction movie that would be done concurrently with the Apollo footage. You would learn everything, making the high budget science fiction movie, and then he would apply that to the faking of the Apollo imagery. So he began working on the script, Voyage to the Stars, with Arthur C. Clarke, and they began working closely with high-ranking members of NASA who were flying, I'm not kidding you, were flying from Houston, from their NASA headquarters in Houston to London, to the studios there where he was shooting 2001. All of the top brass at NASA were working very closely on 2001 with Stanley Kubrick. So Kubrick So Kubrick is now spending 4 years, from 1964 to 1968, making 2001 Space Odyssey. At the same time, NASA, from 1964 to 1969, is working on creating the Apollo launch program to go to the moon. So one of the questions I've been getting from the beginning of stating these theories that I'm telling you is, there's no studio in England big enough to film the moon landings. And that's true. There is no studio in England big enough. Shepperton, where he was filming 2001, certainly does not have a soundstage that would be big enough to do it. So then that becomes the big problem. Where did he shoot it? And we now know that there was a person in England who lived near the Cardington blimp hangar, which is about 45-minute drive north from London. And he was there at the Cardington blimp hangar in the 1960s. I think it was 1968. He said that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were there in the blimp hangar. They had created a lunar set that was, to the detailed lunar set, and that they were practicing their moonwalks in this giant hangar. And of course, I know that Stanley Kubrick liked to sleep in his own bed. And so he would have had to have picked a place that was, within a certain distance of where he lived. And the Cardington blimp hangar is, I estimated, I think 35-minute drive from where he lived in St. Albans in North London. So this is where they filmed the moon landings, at Cardington blimp hangar. And we have an eyewitness who actually saw those guys there. So now we know where the moon landings were actually filmed. And so Kubrick, he kept it a secret. He did his work. He made the moon landings look as good as they could. They don't really look that good in today's digital world, but they could have done a lot better faking of it than they did. But that's how they did it. And Kubrick, of course, gave his confession to this whole thing in the movie The Shining. And you can watch my movie, Kubrick's Odyssey #1, for that evidence. And you can watch Kubrick's Odyssey #2 to see that Kubrick used the film 2001: A Space Odyssey not only as a research and development process for the moon landings, but also to tell an incredibly spiritual story about alchemy and aliens. And it's still the standard of science fiction films that no other science fiction film has ever stood up to. There is no film better than 2001: A Space Odyssey. So that's the story of James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, and John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, who was the one behind us trying to get to the moon by the late 1960s, and Stanley Kubrick, arguably the greatest filmmaker of all time. Now, I will say this. In the movie The Shining, the first scene in the movie, Kubrick is implying that he met Kennedy, because you have to remember that Jack Nicholson is Kubrick in The Shining. He's playing the Kubrick character, the caretaker. And the first scene, he's getting his interview with the manager of The Shining, of the Overlook Hotel. And Kubrick hired actor Barry Nelson, who's a dead ringer, for JFK. And then he even put a little toupee on him to give him like JFK's kind of hairstyle. And he holds his hands like this. Was a famous way that JFK would hold his hands while he was having conversations. And so he is implying that he met JFK at some point. So maybe they had already, picked Kubrick before JFK's death. I don't know. Well, of course, I don't think JFK died on November 22nd, but he did disappear from the scene. I'm pretty sure of that. And Johnson became the president. I'll tell you a little story before I go, so that you understand how my own experiences with all of this. So, of course, I'm contending that there's a secret space program, and it's been going on since the mid 1950s, and it's run parallel with NASA. NASA is like a cover, and then the secret space program is the real deal. And I've heard from many insiders that I'm right about this, so I don't even want to hear about it. And I believe we have a base on the moon. I believe we put a base there in the early 60s, a Project Horizon. It was funded. It's on the books. It was funded by the Pentagon, the Navy, of course. And it was the deal was to put, I think, 1,000 Marines up on a base on the moon so they could watch the Earth all the time. High ground, remember Sun Tzu's laws, high ground and secrecy, right? So if you have the high ground, the moon is the ultimate high ground. So yes, it makes total sense that you would put a base up there. And I've been told there's a base up there. It's mostly underground. So anyway, in 1994, I was hanging around with Richard Hoagland, of course, the guy who wrote The Monuments of Mars, about the face on Mars. And like I said, we were going around from NASA establishment to a NASA establishment, looking at archives and all sorts of incredible stuff. And I had an in with a very, very big investment law firm in Seattle, Washington. And this is a very famous investment law firm. And if I said the name, and I'm not going to, you have heard of them. They're involved in several recent disgraceful things that have been going on in our country. The hoax and all that. They're associated with it. But anyway, this investment law firm, they would take, like, I think it was 1 hour a week, and you would get 5 minutes. So 12 different people or groups would get 5 minutes in front of all these high whiz lawyers to tell them about why they should invest in this, whatever they're talking about. And I got a meeting. I got a 5-minute meeting. And so it was me and Richard Hoagland. And so the deal was that I would get up and I would give my 2.5 minutes. Then he would get up and he would give his 2.5 minutes. And that would be our 5 minutes. So my 2.5 minutes were to describe the project and then how it would work filming. It was a movie. And then he would take the 2.5 minutes and explain the technology behind how we would make the movie. And the movie that we were proposing was called Return to the Moon. And what we were proposing was a $25 million film, IMAX film, that would be 3D. And what we would do is we would launch, probably from the South Pacific, we would launch a private rocket, which would send a camera to the moon. It would orbit the moon about 30 to 40 times before its orbit finally decayed and would crash into the surface of the moon. But in those 30 to 40 orbits, we would fly over Hyginus Rill and over the Apennine Mountains, and we had it all planned out. And we would collect all of this footage, and then we would put together a 25 to 35 minute IMAX special called Return to the Moon. So I got done with my 2.5 minutes, and Richard, he gets up to describe the rocket and all the things that we would have to do this fully. And we were there for 4 hours. We went off into another room. We had this incredible view of downtown Seattle and Puget Sound. And for 4 hours, we talked with these high-powered lawyers about this project. And they were really, really gung-ho. So they assigned a guy named Frank to do diligence. Frank was the flight instructor for both Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, the two guys that landed on the moon. And he was just a balls ass guy. He landed the helicopters in Vietnam behind enemy lines to pick up, wounded GIs. He was just fearless. And I think he was shot like 16 times, something like that. He had scars all over his body, and he was a badass dude. And so I felt pretty good having him be our due diligence guy. And he actually lived right near me in the Seattle area, which was quite a coincidence. So this was on Bainbridge Island, which is a little island about 3 miles west of Seattle. You have to take a ferry to get to the island and back. And I was working in Seattle, and I would get on the ferry to go home at night. And when I was getting on the ferry, and it was about a week after we did this, I saw Frank on the ferry. And I said, Frank, how's it going with the due diligence on our project? And Frank looked really kind of scared, and he said, well, I called the head of NASA. I told him that what we were doing, and he got really, really mad at me. And he said, if you launch that thing, we will blow it out of the sky and never call me again, and hung up on him. And I said, so that's it. The deal's over. He goes, yeah, we're not doing it. And so, I was really disappointed. I was going to be one of the producers on this film. So, I went home and, kind of chalked it up to experience. But about a week later, on a rainy night, I lived in the middle of the woods. I had a really long driveway, and I could see anybody coming down the driveway because their headlights would flood my house. And I saw these headlights coming down the driveway and wasn't expecting anyone. So I see the car pull up, and I see Frank get out of the car, and he comes out, and I'll open up my front door, and I say, you want to come in? He says, no. I said, well, you're going to stand out in the rain? He goes, yeah. And I said, okay, what do you want? And he said, well, Jay, you remember when you told us in that meeting that you were writing a book about all of this, and that you had all this inside scoop on NASA and the lunar program and Apollo? I said, yeah. He said, I see you have a fire going in your fireplace. I suggest you throw the manuscript in the fire. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, I don't think you should be, I like you, you're a nice kid, and I don't think that you should be, I don't want to see you getting in any trouble. So that's what I think you should do. And he said, goodbye, I'll see you later. And he left. And I sat looking at this manuscript, which is 250 pages of research. It had taken me like 6 years to write. And I threw it. And my wife said, you got to get rid of it. So I threw it in the fire, and it burned up. And so anyway, that's the end of my story, and that's the end of my talk here today on Kennedy Kubrick and the secret space program. Hopefully one day we'll get disclosure, and some of this technology can be released. That's really my only goal here, is to get some, especially the free energy technology. I just really think it's important to release that, because we're just destroying the friggin' environment. And, it's really the way out. We know you guys have it. Tesla had invented it by the mid 40s. So we know you guys have it. And I know a lot of you are lobbying your leaders to let this technology out, because you talked to me about it. And I just want you to know that I support what you're doing. And if you need any help, just let me know. And thanks for watching, everybody. My name is Jay Weidner. This is Reality Check. Hit like, subscribe, and all that other stuff. And I will see you in my next show.